I was 34, freshly divorced, working a double shift job and sitting in a worn down Columbus radiotherapy facility. Cancer was the last thing on my mind. I just wanted my head to stop throbbing, and I had a feeling the tests I'd taken would soon reveal why. The doctor's voice seemed detached when he told me the news: a tumor pushing against my brain, shrinking my vision field, triggering migraines. But there was a plan. 3 quick sessions of radiotherapy, the tech had said, then a review. That was the whole promise. A quick, quiet recovery. The first session wasn't anything special. The waiting room was full of patients, some coughing or murmuring in quiet voices. The machines hummed with a low intensity that was almost comforting. The techs explained that I might feel some mild discomfort, but there was no real risk. Columbus's hospital staff was known for being solid, I thought, so I trusted them. Little did I know, I was about to be the recipient of something far more insidious than just mild discomfort. And my first dose started out normal enough. I sat, head pressed back in the cold cradle of the machine, the whirring starting up like a slow symphony. I remember drifting into a half-sleep, lulled by the methodical sounds. It was when I woke that things felt wrong. The nurse found me lying there, cold sweat clinging to my skin as if I'd run a marathon. I was dazed, shaky, barely able to lift my hand. Normal, they said. The tech smiled tightly, handed me some water, and directed me to the waiting room with instructions to rest up. But as I sat, head pounding, I began to notice something strange about the other patients. Their eyes, pale, sunken, almost hollow, watched me in silence. Some wore masks to hide their faces, while others seemed to shield themselves from the light. But they all looked at me with an understanding only a sufferer of something deeply horrifying could know. When I caught a reflection of myself in a glass door, I noticed my skin was oddly pale too. But it wasn't just the pallor that unsettled me. It was the intensity in my own gaze, a hollow stare that hadn't been there just hours before. I brushed it off as fatigue, but at home, things took a darker turn. That night, I barely slept. A searing pain sliced through my skull as if a live wire pulsed behind my eyes. And something else was gnawing at me, a strange itch, not on my skin, but beneath it, deep within my bones. It was something raw and invisible, a creeping sensation that no amount of scratching could quell. The next day, the phone rang. The nurse's voice was kind, but there was an edge to it, something too smooth. "Just following up," she said, though the words felt less like a check in and more like a veiled warning. "You may experience some headaches. That's normal." But the headaches she mentioned felt like an understatement. This wasn't just a headache. It was like my skull was a hive, buzzing, teeming with something I couldn't name. When I went in for my second dose, the waiting room was even quieter. The hollow-eyed patients were still there, their silent gazes following me as if I were something to be pitied. They knew I could see it. The techs guided me to the machine again, and this time I felt a surge of icy panic as they strapped me down. The technician's face was unreadable as he checked the dials, a look of unsettling precision in his eyes. The machine hummed louder than before. I thought I could hear it screaming. That night, the pain was unbearable. The light in my room seemed to cut through my skull, and I began to see shadows, vague, shifting shapes that flickered just beyond my vision. I would have written it off as delirium if it weren't for the feeling that they were watching, waiting. The next morning, I felt so weak I could barely stand. A doctor called to inform me that my case had been flagged for review. When I demanded to know what had gone wrong, he dodged the question, saying only that they were adjusting my next dose. Adjusting. I was a lab rat, and they had just twisted the dial higher. The third dose was the final one, they said. This time, my arrival was met with whispering from the staff. One of the nurses glanced nervously as I walked in, then quickly looked away. I tried to catch her gaze, to ask what was happening to me, but she just murmured, "Everything's fine." Normal reactions. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. The machine was ready and waiting, cold, metallic, its mechanical arms reaching toward me like the claws of some unfeeling beast. As I lay there, I felt the hum build and build until I could feel every cell in my body trembling. The smell of burning filled the air. I remember screaming, not from pain but from fear, from a gut-wrenching dread that something inside me was changing. It felt as though something was tearing itself out of me. I was sent home with a cold pack and a promise that the pain would fade. But that night, as I lay in bed, I could feel the change seeping into every inch of me. My bones ached like they were rotting from within. My vision blurred, the room swirling around me as if I were floating in some unseen current. And the shadows, they were no longer just flickers. They loomed, filling the corners of my room, dark and watching, their eyes glinting with something primal, something that understood the agony in a way no human ever could. I knew, with a clarity as sharp as any scalpel, that whatever had been injected into me was killing me slowly, rewriting my cells. I returned to the hospital the following day, barely able to stand, desperate for answers. When I arrived, I was met with an uneasy silence. The doctor, his face grey with guilt, finally confessed. A mishap, he called it, a mistake. The doses had been stronger than intended, too strong. I wasn't the only one. Several patients, those hollow-eyed souls who had stared at me in that waiting room, had been dosed beyond the intended limit. "We're correcting the machine," he said, voice empty. But there was no correcting what had already been done. My cells had already soaked in the radiation, like ink on paper, and there was no going back. As I left the hospital for the last time, I saw the other patients waiting, their hollow eyes following me. I understood now. The shadowed faces, the unspoken connection we shared. We had all been marked, irrevocably changed. The days that followed were a blur of nausea, weakness, and pain. My body began to reject itself, my cells unraveling with each passing moment. And the shadows, they were closer now, closer than ever, their eyes gleaming in the dark like stars that had died long ago. I write this now with the knowledge that I am one of the last to speak. Soon I will be gone, a casualty of a machine's cold precision, a mistake left unchecked. But the shadows, they will remember, and they will be waiting, patient as death, for the next soul to lie beneath that cold, unfeeling machine in Columbus.